Hi everyone, and welcome to a fireside chat with myself, Brooke Maggs, and Greg Kasavin. I'm a senior narrative designer at Remedy Entertainment, and Greg is a writer and creative director at Supergiant Games. We will be having a very casual, relaxed chat about narrative in games, and I'm really excited because I have so many questions to ask Greg, and we were just talking about off camera what our first opportunity to write in games was and where that came from. And Greg, you mentioned it was the Command and Conquer games. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. That was Command and Conquer 3 is the first game I worked on back in 2007, and I got to write the instruction manual for it. So it's no text going in the game itself, but it is a writing opportunity nonetheless. My role was as a producer, so it's not really a writing. I wasn't brought on in a writing capacity, but I think my past experience in the gaming press was known to the team I joined at the time, and they, when there were bits of writing that needed doing, I was always eager to spring for them. But I was saying, on Red Alert 3, which was the first game I worked on start to finish, another real time strategy game about tanks and planes and things blowing each other up. I wrote quite a few of the unit responses, like the little things, the little quips that they say when you click on your little soldiers and whatnot. And I love doing it. I always loved unit responses in strategy games because they have to kind of pack so much information into such a short amount of time, and hopefully they capture kind of the flavor of the unit and give you some of the personality. And so I just loved it. That
And
was
that's
the kind of
not
yeah.
very easy to do, and that's actually a really great way to start writing for games, to think of brevity and also utility and also some personality at the same time.
Yeah, yeah, it has to do
Not
a lot of
easy
different
to do.
things.
Mm,
And the team. I mean, I was very fortunate to work. Guy's name was Michael Pedriana. He was the audio director, but had like a writing background as well. So he had a really good point of view on that balance that you describe of how it has to communicate all these different things while capturing the personality of these units. And he was happy to have someone to just be kind of be as into it
yeah,
as I was,
yeah.
because I think it's seen as a bit like it has to be done, but not necessarily like a joyful part of the development process. But for me, it was all new and exciting. How about you were describing you had a pretty big challenge on your first writing role as well, seeing as words it sounded like were kind of off the table.
Yes, exactly. I joined the Voxel Agents to work on The Gardens Between, and I submitted a short story and some writing samples and things like that, and was brought on. And I imagined that I would be writing for this game and that there would be dialogue, but then it was quickly sort of revealed or realised that it wasn't dialogue that the team was necessarily after, but it was storytelling
Mm.
skills and having an idea of how a story, can go in a game when there's no text or speech. But we had a lot of it's a 3D puzzle game, so we had moments in the game where we could have some very short cutscenes or vignettes, and there was a lot of discussion that I had with the team about what to show in those vignettes to show this story of a friendship between a young boy and girl. And what does it look like when they meet for the first time? If we can't use words, what are the hand actions? What is the music like? What is the environment like? But then also, how does the colour palette change over the course of the game to sort of signify the beginning and middle and end? And there's that sort of rise in tension with music and with the colour palettes and with the weather even. So a lot of that discussion was to do with a narrative structure, which we used sort of the voyage and return structure, and how that works from a story perspective. So a lot of the documentation I prepare, even to this day at Remedy, is to do with the world building and the how, like what the story is and how it is structured and how that comes across. And that is then the material that writers can use to go forth and, obviously we work on it together, but they will ultimately be writing the dialogue at the end of the day. And
Right.
then I do a little bit more, I would say, collaboration with designers and level designers and environment artists to think about the other aspects of storytelling in games. So yes, I was saying to you off camera, I'm not exactly sure of the kind of game I would write myself. A lot of the games that I've worked on have already had stories there, or they've, particularly with the Gardens Between, actually we did develop that together very much so. But then, yes, it's very cool to think about other ways to tell story as well. But dialogue writing is a skill. It's a skill, especially in games.
Yeah, working on a wordless. I've often felt that wordless stories are kind of the highest form of storytelling. There's the game, Playdead's games, particularly Inside, I thought was, a story told with no words whatsoever. I could tell it was clearly kind of a constraint that they set. They want you to kind of experience it in other ways while still understanding, still having a sense of what is going on.
Yes.
And it's so powerful when it's done well, and it's so, I can only imagine how hard it must be when I do see word as a writer. In my capacity as a writer, I think words are just this kind of big. They're kind of a crutch because we can't have these sumptuous animations to express every possible character interaction and things of that nature, and not every moment in our games can be that kind of tightly choreographed to where the what is happening in the scene can be delivered without the use of words. So when whether it's a movie or a game, when they can execute, or like a storybook for that matter, sometimes they're wordless children's books and things like that. It's really impressive to me when the whole story can be conveyed that way.
Well, that's true. It can be very difficult, and also there can be a lot of work that goes into a story to lead up to that wordless moment as well.
Right.
But yes, I mean, when we were doing that on the Gardens Between, we were looking at games. A lot more games were doing that at the time, like Journey as well, and Abzu, and that were more sort of sensorial experiences as well. And I still really enjoy playing those games. Sometimes I like to dip into those games that are a bit more sort of light and exploratory and let you sort of read into the narrative as you like.
Yeah, and you feel, you can still feel the depth of the world when that work is put in, right? When that sense that every detail is intentional, it's such a powerful sense when games can achieve it. So it's something we certainly we always try to strive for, but it's difficult. It's difficult to achieve in practice. I think maybe you could probably relate to this on some extent because you're working in this cross-disciplinary capacity. And in your role as writer, you have this sense of what matters in this world in terms of environmental detail and what the themes and things are. And then you're collaborating with departments who don't necessarily have the same experience with it as you do. So
yes,
what does that collaboration even look like for you at Remedy? Do you kind of meet on a regular basis with different departments? Do you kind of review scenes from games together?
Yes, all of those things. To be honest, that's, I think, one of the challenges of my job, because at the moment, I'm working on Vanguard, which, and so I'm collaborating with the creative director to talk about sort of themes and higher level sort of overview of the game, but then I talk with design, and was the same on Control. I would talk to the game director and to the creative director about their overarching themes and aspirations for the game. And then, as you say, on the ground, people are not necessarily thinking about the themes and aspirations for the game because their work is very much, well, what does this room look like? And how does this character walk? And which is just as important because they are bringing, what is abstract and making it concrete. And that's not an easy job either. But being in between that process is really interesting. I mean, I sometimes wish, when you were talking about words and that being what we have, I often think in my role it would be really useful if I could draw, if not only like semi badly, like, I mean, just semi good, like just tiny bit of good drawing. I do stick figures otherwise, or I badly Photoshop things to try and convey what I want to say, because a lot of the other disciplines are not word based.
Yes.
And also don't have time to read my lengthy documentation, which I've learned to keep very short over time, and learned to dot point, and learned to sort of always constantly trying to find what are just the few key things that these people need to know for their job, but don't need to know, the glorious backstory that I have in my head or the themes of the, overarching narrative, because those things will come out eventually, but then finding what's useful for them is difficult. So I constantly change my methods. I mean, I use kind of flow charting software, I use PowerPoint, I use Word documents. Sometimes I draw in my sketchbook and photograph it and send it to someone, things like that. Or try and find, a reference from a film, something that's a bit more visual. I used to think maybe storyboarding should be something that I would need to learn, but quickly realised that would only make things maybe more complicated. It would just take longer. But
I know what you mean. I have a dependency on words in my craft, and left to my own devices, I will write more and not less. Working with, like, collaborating with the rest of the team, it's just a really kind of self-conscious thing that I still screw up all the time. In fact, of just keep it short. Like, basically everybody is going to benefit from a more concise description of what's going on. You could have, there's still room for the longer form version of it, just kind of, maybe link to it as additional reference.
True. Additional reference. Like, please see my million pages of glorious text. Yeah. But how does the collaboration work for you? Because you're in a much smaller team, and you are also sort of have the overview of sort of everyone, and you would imagine collaborate quite closely with Jen, I believe, is your art director, and to really get the feel. I think that's perhaps one of the reasons why I suspect that your games feel so cohesive and very confident in what they're doing, because you all work so closely.
Yeah, thank you. I think, strictly speaking, we have an easier time collaborating by virtue of being small. It's just with fewer people, there's less likelihood of the kind of the information kind of disseminating incorrectly. That in the game of telephone, right, where information just gets warped the more times it kind of iterates across different people. There's just fewer stages of the game of telephone at a studio like Supergiant, where we're about 20 people, so we're not the smallest in the world, but it's small relative to a AAA studio.
Yes.
And we've still, that's not to say it still has its challenges all the time, and the other benefit we have is that the group of us that has been working together since the Bastion days, our first game, more than 10 years ago, we're all still there, all 7 of us. So, and that includes Jen, our art director, and Darren Korb, our audio director, Amir, who works as kind of functionally lead designer, and our studio director, and so on. So it's often us talking kind of on behalf of our, small, or in some cases single person departments to arrive at that kind of creative collaboration. So when we're talking about whether it's the game concept itself on a very high level or talking about the story, we'll have all those people in the conversation typically. Great. Just to make sure that they each have their point of view on it. Because if we're talking about the story, then Darren, our audio director, is a really critical part of that, because music in our games, I said before, we rely on words. We also rely heavily on music and audio to convey the mood of our games. So Darren has to really understand what we're doing and be feel kind of inspired by it in his own right to kind of take it in whatever wild direction he's going to go in musically. And then when it comes to collaborating with Jen on characters and things like that, that's one of my absolute favorite aspects of the whole process of making games at Supergiant, actually, because she, thankfully for me, as an artist, she does really value having like a lot of information. When she's going to create a design for a character, she really wants to get inside that character's head and know a lot about them. So it just so happens that my own, tendency to say a lot of stuff about them is quite compatible with her approach. And so even for me, I just have this great experience with it, where even when I know roughly what to expect, for Hades, if she's designing the look of Dionysus or someone like that, it's like, well, we kind of know what sort of guy this is, but still she'll come back with something that always is unexpected to me in some really exciting way. So it's really fun to see how she interprets the work. And I think we've come to realize, through that collaborative process, that our games are there's like, the collaboration is really key, and we have it's very it almost feel like we're always sort of compromising in a way, which sounds weird, because that word compromise, it sounds like you're kind of watering something down or making something worse, that no one's having their way. But rather, we're just coming up with something that's a synthesis of everybody's interests, and it's not the thing that any one person at the team would have expected, but it comes together in the way that our games do, and I think it just ends up as a better, more interesting thing than what any single person at the studio would have come up with if they just were in charge, quote unquote, and got to influence every detail directly.
And that's one of the joy of working in games, I think, is that collaboration, and also kind of the fear of not really knowing what you're making until it's made. But everyone you trust that everyone on the team is wanting, as the same kind, if not, better product in the end. Like, everyone's aiming for something, and aiming for something that is sort of challenging for themselves, and also something top quality. But also, I think it's really interesting how a part of the process, especially at the start, is trying to get the same idea of what you're making in everyone's heads, or at least trying to get close enough that it will sort of, all the pieces will settle together by the time you really hit development and go forward. And even when you're in development, things come up. Like you say, there is a certain compromise that happens, but also creative problem solving at that point too. So I know what you mean. You're not losing anything. Things are just sort of being shifted around. One of my favorite things is working with artists too, because they can make visual or like tangible the things that I've had in my head. And that's I don't know about you, but I'm sure that when you see something that Jen has created comes back with more than what you expected, or something extra, you're like, yes, that's it. And that's the feeling that I like to get up and go to work for every day, to be honest, as cheesy as that kind of sounds. But it's when someone gets you creatively, and then you have the space to do that. It's lovely. But I also wanted to go back to dialogue for a minute too, because the dialogue in Hades is incredible. And it's such a joy to have a game that gives me reactive dialogue, instead of a lot of people sort of telling me what to do. people respond to me based on what I've done, which I really
Right.
enjoy. And I was wondering if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit more about your process writing for the game, because I know, for example, if you want to set those variables for those lines to play, you must have had such a joy of a time and maybe also a bit of a hard time keeping track of everything, or did you have a system? Obviously, the firsts for a character is something to comment on, like the first weapon or the first key or the first. But then how did you sort of decide what you'd like characters to comment about?
Yeah, yeah, it was a really fun aspect
Oh, I bet.
of working. Yeah, it was, the first thing, the first decision we made, when kind of once we had a sense of the game we were going to make, is this idea of a roguelike game with narrative continuity. We thought that the format of a game where you're kind of dying and starting over all the time
Yeah,
was
right.
actually a really interesting storytelling constraint, because even in the most hardcore version of a roguelike game where you lose everything every time you die and start completely over from scratch, you as a player still carry forward your knowledge. And so we wanted to like align the narrative experience with the player experience, which is that you do, when you get to a boss for the nth time, right? For the you
Yep.
fought this boss 50 times or something like that. It's no longer, we shouldn't treat this as like, ooh, it's the scary first appearance of this boss, because you've seen them 50 times already.
Yes.
So why not have the characters kind of acknowledge, be self-aware, of the cyclical nature of the structure. So that was really the guiding light. And then knowing that players, then it's this sort of challenging question of, if it's a game that could be played forever, with narrative continuity, how much story do you kind of really need in a game that could? You can't have infinite story, because someone has to, you have to write and record all of it. So what's a good amount? And we just, I think for me it was really all about trying to bring the individual characters to life. So to your specific question, when it came time to think about what specific things should different characters comment on, I would just try to look at it from the point of view of that character. So we talked
Yeah.
about Dionysus before. Dionysus is like really excited by, all the ambrosia and nectar you're collecting, for example. So he might comment on something like that, because that makes sense for Dionysus, because he's all about the ambrosia and the nectar. Whereas for Ares, Ares is all about, the death and destruction and the murder. He's going to keep track of, how many foes you've slain, and he's going to have something to say about each and every weapon that you've picked up, and things of that nature. So that was a fun way of approaching it, because it helped keep it from being too formulaic. Like, I think if every character was templated, if every character talked about your ambrosia, and if every character talked about your weapons, even if they did so in their own distinctive way, I think players would have sort of seen through it a little bit more. Whereas when it's sort of personality driven like that, I think it just helped the individual characters feel more alive. And the reactivity, the part where we do try to acknowledge these small little aspects of player behavior, or the just different circumstances that they're in, we've always been interested in that ever since Bastion. Like, we
True.
think that when games, I think that when the small stuff is so important. Like, the analogy I use, this doesn't apply to me, unfortunately, but it's like in a typical, you go to work, you got a nice haircut over the weekend, and someone's like, hey, nice haircut. When
Yeah.
someone acknowledges nice haircut or nice shoes or something like that, you feel good. Like, who knows why deep down, but it's just someone noticing and caring that there was this small change about you. And it's kind of, our games just try to have the equivalent of that moment a lot. Just pay attention to the smaller things.
Yeah.
And when we do enough of it, suddenly it,
It really pays off.
hopefully,
Yeah.
yeah. And we just kind of chipped away at it over the early access period. Like, I didn't realize, I don't think any of us knew we didn't have a good sense for like the content volume until we were basically done. And then people were like, oh, it's a lot of stuff. We're like, okay, cool. I guess we did enough.
That's the good reaction from everyone.
Yeah, I was always, I think like insecurity definitely was a motivating factor for me of like, it's not enough. People can play this game forever. It just needs to, and I think for me, really, it was mostly, like I said, a desire to bring the characters themselves to life, for them to, if we're going to have Ares, the god of war, then Ares should talk about all the things that Ares would talk about and respond to all the things, in the context of the game. And that's just how it all panned out.
That's lovely. I mean, and if I may ask a question as a narrative designer, a little bit about what it was like to work with the underlying system from a writing perspective, because I can only imagine, like, all I can see is spreadsheets, really. And, when it comes to, I would like Ares to say this line once a player has done this, and this, or is it okay, or is it okay.
Yeah, so that was it was quite at heart it was a very simple system, which is that like the rest of the game, it at the foundational level there is randomness. So there's a big table of things that Ares can talk about, and with no other sort of requirements put on these different little story moments, the game is just going to pick one at random and give it to you.
Yeah.
But then we could start to layer on the different requirements, and over time, the kind of, we called it the game state requirements. And over the course of the project, we kept adding more and more specific game state conditions, to the point where at the end of the project, it was, I don't know, it must have been many hundreds of these things, and sometimes extremely specific. So at the start of development, we had things like, how many runs have you done? Is this your fifth run, or is it your first? Or like, how many foes how many enemies have you killed? Like really basic stuff. But then toward the end, it's like, how many fish have you caught? How many do you have right now? What type of fish are they? And
you can really go down a rabbit hole with those, can't you? You could.
Yes. And they were, they were born. It's nice because in many cases they were just born of wanting to execute specific narrative moments, because they were quite easy to add. And in many cases I added them myself. Sometimes I would need engineering help if it was a little more complicated. But yeah, and then also one of the most kind of basic and also the most vital checks would simply be whether the player had run into a certain narrative event already or not. So to create like a story sequence, it would simply check, did the previous event in the story sequence already occur? And if so, play the next one. And almost all of it would just play one and only one time, because if big story events, repeat themselves, it breaks immersion, and things like that. And yeah, so that's how
so
it was all constructed. Yeah.
Chain of sort of big story events that would, I guess, essentially be somewhat linear.
Yes.
And then you could have dialogue lines from characters about those things once they had happened. But then outside of that, I really like too that you have the opportunity to build out the characters by having them pop in and say things about what the player is doing. But at any time, was there a risk of having a dialogue appear earlier in the game that would give something away later in the game? Or did you just find ways to avoid that by having characters comment on other things? Or so, for example, if you've seen Nyx, someone might pop in and go, I know that you've met Nyx, and, da-da-da. But is there a situation where did you find any dialogue bugs, I guess, really? Is that something you had to keep an eye on? Or?
Oh, yeah. There were a ton of, this is one of those things where I think the early access nature of development was really helpful, because there's so many, there are infinite sort of permutations of the random, the dialogue is sort of served to you in a largely random order, except for some of the linear sequences. And also, a ton of it is optional. So I have to handle the case where, even though this case might not even exist in reality or maybe extraordinarily rare, but someone can go through the whole game without there's like one exception for each of these characters, but you never have to talk to Nyx, you never have to talk to Achilles, you never even have to talk to Hades at the House of Hades, and I have to account for that as a real but remote possibility. And then the other complication is players can get through the game at really different rates. It's possible to clear the game on your very first try, and then I have to handle, what the characters say under that set of circumstances. What they would normally say under that set of circumstances makes no sense at all. So I have to handle that case. Some of those cases were born of bugs submitted, of players, reporting that this event made no sense in this case, or I wish, or sometimes it would just be like, oh, I wish the character, acknowledged that I did this, or something like that. And other times, I would just, in many cases, I would just think through the possibilities as I did, just here, of like, well, what are all the things that could happen within the constraints of the system? We have like a subplot around Orpheus and Eurydice, who are, separated in death in the underworld. And the thing is, both of the characters are optional. So whether you meet them, in what order you meet them, how much you talk to one before talking to the other, all influences like how their main subplot is introduced. So it actually, like, many of our subplots start with a wide number of possible kind of inroads, and then they funnel into a more linear outcome.
I see.
So that's kind of the structure of the kind of more substantial, storylines that happen over the course of many escape attempts, as opposed to the one-off quips.
I see. And the fact of the matter is, you can't possibly predict how all the lines will be said and in what order. And also, I notice, while the levels are not procedural, I imagine maybe something like the distribution of items might be, or something like that, which would be what the dialogue system keeps track of. So you might not even know when a player will come across something, but there might be certain points you'll know when they will for sure come across this one thing, maybe. So
yes, that's right.
It's so interesting because, I mean, I haven't written a game like this before, but I really appreciate what it's doing because, I mean, alternatively, with Control, we would do level reviews and we would know where every line is going to trigger. Right. We would know where there's going to be combat. We would know where to put a narrative item so we could be sure that a player will find that before they come across a boss. So everything, or many things about Control is handcrafted, especially, from the narrative and the dialogue. There's a lot of cinematics and there's a lot of, we know where we've placed the Dr. Darling videos and in what order to show his story over time in those videos. Yeah. And this is obviously a completely different way of telling a story, but also like building one, keeping track of one, and not knowing how it's going to unfold. I think it's really fascinating and it's really exciting. I think that's one of the great things a game can do. Remedy's games are very cinematic and very atmospheric, and I find Hades very reactive, I'm sort of not knowing what's going to unfold. In a game like Control, I know that I'm sort of going for a sort of more linear, and that's not a bad word, but more of a crafted experience, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Not to say that your experience isn't crafted, it's crafted in a different way. And it's really exciting to think about the system underneath it, which is why I'm asking you so many questions about it.
No, it was, we're more accustomed to making in our own way. Certainly we haven't made anything on the scope of Control, which I told you, for the record, I thought Control was amazing, kind of like just everything that I've loved about Remedy's games over the years, just kind of firing on all cylinders. The way the world, just the sense of mystery about the world, and the kind of balance of I would say like delightful strangeness. Talking about Dr. Darling and some of the moments at the end with him, and things like that. It's just wonderful stuff without giving too much away.
Thank you very much.
But yeah, like, in our earlier games like Bastion and Transistor, they're much more the way that you described, where there's a specific set of levels. They come in a generally specific order. The dialogue lines trigger at certain times. There's some, reactivity has always been important to us. So there will be moments where where the story will deviate a bit based on what the player is doing. But generally it's, it's 85% the same or something like that for from one player to another. And you have that analogy as well, because not everyone is going to read, all the lore items, or they could skip optional areas and things like that.
Yes.
So in Hades, it was in a word, like scary. I mean, it was we had to really embrace the randomness of it as but it is something that came with a degree of insecurity, I guess, when it came to the narrative. And it was really not just from a narrative standpoint. I think across the board, we've been really definitely pleasantly surprised, but surprised is the key word at how much players liked it, given that randomness is key. You would think that with randomness influencing the game so strongly, that some percentage of players, and it could be a decent percentage, right? Like 3% of players would just have a miserable time because randomness just ruined everything for them. But it's been remarkable that like players' experience with a narrative, we've generally heard positive things despite despite us not having the level of control over it that we have exerted in our previous games. So because I think the trade-off, turns out to be strong. Like, we give up some of that kind of authorial control over the structure of it. Yeah. But the reactivity that happens more dynamically and the scope of the narrative, I think, more than makes up for that aspect. And it becomes more of this, we've always, I think with games, the interactivity is this opportunity to make this story feel more personal in some way. It's not just a story that you're, watching on the screen. You're kind of part of it. Yeah. So we think that reactivity is the key to, like, sort of striking that balance between the benefits of an authored story and the sense of, like, oh, this is personal to you. No one else experienced this game, the way you did just now, that sort of thing.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And I think, more and more games at the moment, I've noticed, entertaining the idea of death being a repetitive thing and being an advantageous thing. And that conceit in the narrative is really interesting too, that allows this sort of cyclical sort of learning and bringing of your own reading as a player. Like, it creates what I'm trying to say is it creates an interesting player narrative too, because my discussion of Hades with someone else will always be a bit different, because we've got our own playthroughs to talk about, and I think that's really interesting. I mean, it's the same for other games as well. Like Control, people won't necessarily play the same way, but it will unfold the same way, if that makes sense. Right. Which, is a stylistic decision, so which is perfectly, fine. But it's, I find that I come to Hades because I'm like, yes, I want to see if I can get a bit further, and I want to see if I can find out what these characters are going to say to me next, which is really, something. I was going to ask too a little bit more about, we've spoken about collaborating with designers, we've spoken about how we don't always know what we're making until it's made. And even in what you were saying, being in Greenlight, getting a lot of feedback was very helpful. Um, what do you think are some storytelling tools that are perhaps overused or not used enough in games?
Yeah, I think I think the not it's easier to say not about not used enough. I mean, I would just say in the spirit of what we've been talking about, just the really leaning into the genre form itself and
Yeah,
using the genre structure as a storytelling constraint in almost like a self-conscious way. It doesn't have to. I don't think that Hades is like, there's some moments of fourth wall breaking, but it's not like, hey, you're playing a video game and it's not that level of self-awareness of the structure, but it is using the structure as the central conceit of, we wouldn't have come up with the idea for the story of Hades if we hadn't already decided to make it a roguelike game where you were going to be dying and starting over all the time. So I
yes,
think for us, we just try to really examine the genre conventions that we're using. It doesn't make us not want to use those conventions. Like we love the traditions of game design and try to build on classic traditions rather than just sort of discarding them. But we do want to understand why we're using those traditions. Why does this structure of dying and returning to checkpoint, or having extra lives, or there's so many like
well,
different kind of
questioning them
stock.
too, not necessarily including them because that's what the genre does.
Yeah,
And you've spoken before about having that, like not having it a completely punishing roguelike game that you're always advancing in knowledge, but you're also advancing in the story and you're advancing in
right.
strength and power. It really, like, I really don't mind at all that I die in Hades. I actually rather
Yeah,
enjoy it.
yeah. I mean,
It's
that
a
was a
great
conscious
achievement.
goal.
Yeah.
That's really what we hoped we could accomplish. So
Mm,
it's on one hand, it's I love hearing that, and on the other hand, I know that it's really good to hear because it's something that we put so much work into. And
yeah,
like,
it's
as a
not
game
easy to
developer, you
accomplish.
want to feel like the things that you focus on ideally should be the things that stand out
Yes.
about your game. So I'm glad that our focus on that moment, on making the moment of dying and starting over not as frustrating as it often is, and maybe even something to look forward to, that really worked out for the game. Because yeah, again, like, what's so wonderful about roguelike games is that they're different every time you play. But if you get frustrated and stop playing, you're not experiencing the part that's good about them, which is the restart. So
For sure.
yeah, and I think as far as like I don't know, like overused techniques. I mean, it's easy. I don't. Nothing jumps to mind because I don't think that. I think there's like executions of things that can be kind of overdone, but the techniques themselves I don't think are bounded. Like, it's tempting to say, oh, cutscenes, they're used too often, but I don't
Yes.
I don't personally agree with that. It's
I,
because
well, I mean,
yeah,
it
game
sort of depends on how you execute them, doesn't it? Like you're
exactly.
saying, it's all in the execution of the narrative, and how it, yeah, how it goes down.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that jumped to my mind was, funnily enough, narration. And both
Yeah.
of our games have interesting kinds of character narration.
Yeah.
But also Bastion was sort of that's one of the examples I use when I talk about we could actually play with narration a little bit more in games, and I think games are picking up on that now, to be honest. But there are a lot of narrative sort of techniques that happen in other media that I think games can do, but in their own way, like you say, in a sort of their own execution. There'll
Yeah.
always be a place for those tried and true storytelling methods because they're, useful to getting the story across.
Yeah,
So,
and they are
yeah,
really different across narration. I think in movies often narration, I think, falls falls really flat. It's
It
like
can,
often
yeah.
there to just sort of give you the subtext where if the scene was executed a different way, it just wouldn't be necessary. But in games, it creates this really interesting contrast where you could kind of use the narration to provide information that would never be available to the player in any other way, or maybe even to like contrast the player's actions somehow. So I do find those things really fascinating. And actually, Max Payne was one of the games I was thinking about while working on Bastion, and we didn't think that the narration in Bastion was necessarily we didn't think it was this kind of newfangled technique. I'm like, Max Payne, Prince of Persia, The Sands of Time, these games
That's
have done
true.
amazing things with narration.
Yes.
We just kind of used it exclusively,
Mhm.
but that was because we couldn't do cutscenes or things of that nature. So it's funny that it worked out as this sort of defining. I felt even in that case that we were very much working in a tradition that had been obviously still not fully explored, because as you say, there's just, even all these years later, there's definitely a lot there. Yeah.
Yeah. And which tools and it's a bit of a loaded question because it really does depend on the kind of game, and it depends on the kind of game that you're making, the kind of game we want to make, the story we want to tell, and also what we can possibly make in the time and budget and team size that we have to
Yeah,
make it.
exactly.
So those creative constraints can be really, really useful with storytelling as
Yeah.
well. Mm.
Yeah, and games can just kind of do it any, unlike with I mean, I think they're kind of closer to books in that way, where I think in many ways the form is
Yeah.
unbounded. There's just so many perspectives, and kind of the size of the work can vary a great deal, and that can influence the story a lot, right? The difference between a 200, 190 page novella and like 1,000 page epic, it's like it's going to have a
True.
very different story structure.
Yes.
And I think with games, it's just one of the yeah, it's part of what's exciting about them, that there's no firm convention for how
No.
story should be delivered in games, or how present it should be. I do feel, I'm sure folks in our line of work would agree. I feel that just about any game can be enhanced with narrative,
Hmm.
um,
Yeah.
in some way, even like a but I was going to say even like a puzzle game, or anything like that. But of course, it's not strictly needed to make a
No,
great game.
that's true.
So I think that helps. For me, it's always a useful perspective to keep in mind of like, well, this has to be enhancing the experience in some direct way, where if you were to just remove all of it, you have to be able to say that this game is not as well off, without any of this stuff in it. That's a good check of
That's a
like
very
whether
good rule of thumb. Yes,
yeah,
exactly. Huh. Yeah.
as simple as that is.
It's as simple
But
as
yeah.
that. Yeah. Is it enhancing the experience? But speaking of experience, what I'm going to actually use one of your questions because I really liked this. What was your best experience you've had writing for a game or working on a game? Do you have any sort of standout moments?
Yeah, I think it's like, for me, Bastion was the first game I got to work on, where I just kind of where I wrote the whole thing.
Mm.
The the characters and the arc of the story. And so I think for me, when we first showed Bastion, it was at a PAX event in 2010, and it got such a positive response to the narration. That was like very, very. It was very gratifying, in a way that because I'd never done it. I hoped I could do it, but I didn't know if I could do it right. I
Yeah,
hadn't had the
I get
experience of, and so I think I have a really fond memory. It was a tough project to work on, but I really, Amir Rao, who's our studio director, and we collaborated so closely on that story and on integrating it I just think back on that really fondly. But then, and I honestly thought that I could sort of never recapture that again, and in many ways I can't. But something like Hades is the closest I've come since, where it felt really, it just felt very kind of efficient. We were, it was really fun to work on all these characters. The work was resonating with our players, and so it was, and I got to, you know, put in all these kind of ridiculously obscure events in some cases, and know that someone's going to find this stuff. It's fine. Like, it's this work is worth it. It's all, yeah. So, I did really enjoy that aspect of working on Hades as well. How about for you?
Two stand out in my mind. The one you reminded me of just then was probably showing the Gardens Between at a PAX when so we had taken lots of like live plants, because the game is very beautiful, sort of plant-like islands and things like that you move these characters through with time. And so we'd sort of spent a lot of hours in the morning setting up the stand. As you probably know, it's a lot of work to show your game at PAX. But then this young girl came over and she was playing the game by herself, so she was fine, she could play it, she was enjoying it, and she loved it. And I was like, hello, like, would you? And she kind of was a bit shy and she walked off, and I'm like, oh, well. And then she came back with her older sister, and she said, cool. Now I'm going to show you how to play. And she just wanted to, it was lovely. It was so lovely.
Because you didn't know how she felt when she walked off initially.
Exactly. I didn't know how she felt, but also I really like the idea that, like, it obviously resonated with her, and she felt like this game was for her, which I really enjoyed. And then playing Control and being in those level review meetings where, I mean, they're a little bit stressful towards the end of development and everything's falling into place. But playing through some of the missions in a room with, you know, our writers and level designers and environment artists for those specific areas and game designers, and all watching it fall into place and taking notes. And saying, you know, oh, okay, maybe we should, it's not clear that the player needs to do this, let's get another dialogue line in there, do we have time, maybe, let's try it, you know, things like that. Any dialogue lines we're adding by that point have to be recorded by a certain time. And that was really thrilling, especially too watching the motel sequences fall into place, because I got to sort of own those areas as the narrative designer, which was very fun. Especially because they're these interstitial kind of calm, puzzle-solving, moody moments in the game where you know you're probably not going to get shot, and you can just sort of look around and take it in. And I had a lot of fun working with a sound designer, Sam, on that, and the level designers, and it was great. But it wasn't easy because I wasn't super new by that point, but I had to really understand what the creative direction for them was and sort of carry that out across the team and work out how to communicate that. And one of the things about one of your questions actually that you had was about new weird and getting it right. And it's not easy, and one of the standout memories I have of that is a sort of an anecdote I tell often, which is in one of the rooms you have to turn paintings up the right way for the furniture to go from the top to the floor to get the key from the table. And all of that was fine, and when I did a review, that was okay, but the next day the sound designer messaged me and said, the room shakes and now there's dust that falls. Do I have to add a sound for that? And I went, what? So we looked at it, and indeed there was dust in the room shaking. And we went and chatted to the level designer. He said, oh yeah, I added that in because, you know, the player needs to know that there's been a change in the room. And it's definitely not the wrong decision. Like, it's right, but it's hard to say tonally it's wrong, because in the new weird, the furniture doesn't actually fall to the floor. It mysteriously goes up the right way.
Right.
So the room doesn't need to shake, and then sort of having to ask people to undo their work, but then realizing how important it is to convey these things kind of the first time if I can, to avoid that. I mean, look, it wasn't a huge deal. They just went, all right, we'll take it out. It's cool. But that's the kind of attention to detail that we sort of had to take with maintaining that new, weird, strange tone, because that artistic decision isn't a wrong decision, but it's just not the right one for the tone of those areas. So
and I relate to that kind of story a lot, because it's often we have those moments all the time, and
it's hard, right? Because they're so excited and they've picked up on what you've been saying and the creativity of the world and the themes, and you're like, oh no.
Yeah, and we're fortunate. It's a bit of a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, for us, we can often quickly add an audio line or something similar to what you've said, of like acknowledge some change, but I try, part of my role is to you want people. It's one of the challenges of game development. It's like how much work are you creating for others with this change that you're making, and are you sure that and if you are creating work for others, have you notified them?
Yeah, that's
are they
true.
aware?
Yes.
And we can't, no matter how much experience we have, we definitely still have moments of like, oh, I didn't realize. I thought this was a small thing. I didn't realize that this would have this, kind of cascading effect, or
Yes. But it didn't. I mean, it should have, but it didn't occur to me then that, of course, that creates. That room shake will then create more work for an audio designer, which is all a bit much when you're in the heat of development. It is quite interesting. But how do you, as a creative director, I guess it's handy to be the creative director and the writer, because you can ensure or communicate the story to other people who are sort of implementing the story, or they can put their own flair on it, like we were talking about earlier. So that that's quite handy and doesn't require as much communication necessarily. But
though I feel my role is like highly, despite the title, my role is highly reactive, and it is kind of there's the initial. Ideally, we get everyone aligned on the broader creative direction and what we're trying to accomplish, but then from there, people's personal work can take over, and then I just kind of, with the narrative, I try to respond to it and adapt to it, whether it's the design or the art. And just kind of, so much of my role, I think so much of the function of the narrative in our games is to tie together elements that otherwise would have nothing to do with each other. Or maybe not I should say nothing, but less to do with each other, let's say.
Exactly.
And because I think you can, I don't know if I'll take a guess that you could relate to this also. Like, I think that the degree to which players may feel that everything is highly intentional in a game is sometimes over stated. Like, there's less intention than can be perceived. But I think the narrative can provide that sort of connective tissue to sort of back solve intentionality where maybe there wasn't any to begin with.
That's true.
So
yes,
I try to look for those opportunities as much as possible, and those sometimes out of those little happenstance moments of like an artist added this random little detail. It's like, wait a minute, the character has to say something about this. Otherwise it makes no sense. Those can make for really strong moments in the game, even though they were never planned.
That's true. Yes. And they're also, very challenging sometimes, or, and you think to yourself, how am I going to make this make sense?
Yes.
And then somehow you do. Or sometimes you try. I think some of the I think some of the documents in Control sort of helped explain some things that we couldn't necessarily give a lot of dialogue time to, for example. And they certainly help with building out the world that we, didn't have time to pack into the main story or to the side missions as well. So we certainly found a lot of different ways to try and work all of that in. Especially if people are curious about how does the hiss work? Like, outside of, it appears to take over people's bodies and get aggressive, So, but we had very lengthy discussions about how that works, which probably doesn't always have the chance to come to the surface. But, in the narrative room, we're always trying to make sense of things or have already got this sort of underlying logic we're trying to convey. But yeah, I think narrative is definitely that discipline that can do a lot of problem solving, backwardly, when those things come up. So yes, and that's, we can be, because text at the end of the day is quite cheap when it comes down to putting it in the engine and having it sort of executed. But
yeah, exactly. It's one of the less obviously when it's like a big cutscene or something that is not cheap, but there's as like a it's always nice when a game has a more kind of a simpler technique to fill in some of the gaps where needed. And I wanted to say, like, with Control, it's such a great example of where you, as a player, I think I really value not having things over explained in that game, but I also feel that it is a game where the explanations do exist. Like, I think I've grown comfortable personally over time of, like, well, even if the explanations don't make it into the game, I think if you bother to make them exist as part of development, that it will, the feeling that something is explainable will ultimately transfer, even if not all the information itself is conveyed.
That's
if that makes sense.
Greg, that's such a great point.
Mystery.
Yes, we are very keen on not over-explaining things in our games. And one thing that I am a big advocator of is that even if no one else in the world knows, everyone in the narrative team needs to kind of know. Because otherwise it's very hard to write something that feels cohesive if everyone's sort of got a different idea of how the logic of the world works. Even if it's a bonkers, crazy explanation that really has no business being in the game or being online, if we know what it is and it's cohesive enough, we don't even need to necessarily explain it to the rest of the development team, but we just know what that is. And maybe that's one of the mysteries that all the characters talk about. They're like, I don't know what that thing is. Maybe it does this. But we know what it is. And sometimes there can be reluctance to want to explain it because as soon as we explain it to ourselves, that mystery is gone. But I think it is important to kind of think through what the mystery could be and then kind of all tentatively agree. But then, of course, the benefit of narrative is because no one knows what that was, we could change it if we needed to.
If need be. Right.
So it's like, oh, okay, that's not working now. What's a new explanation? Cool. Well, now it's that. So yeah, that's a lot of fun as well. But that comes right back to the start of the conversation of like how much information do you need to give to the team really just to sort of feed their creative fire and then let them come up with something and let them surprise you, because if you dictate too much or give them 50 pages of your world explanation, they're like, okay, let me just do my thing, please.
Right.
So yeah. But this has been an absolutely wonderful chat. I think we're at time just about. So I hope everyone enjoyed our chat about narrative and games. And honestly, I could probably chat longer, but we'll wrap it up right here. So thank you very much, Greg. This has been awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Great.